The detectives found her lying face down in the master bedroom, the engagement ring still on her finger. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, just a woman who had trusted the wrong man. What they didn't know yet was that she wasn't his only victim. But to understand how Margaret Wilson ended up dead in her own home, you have to go back 8 months. Back to when she still believed in second chances. Margaret was 58 years old and had just buried her husband of 30 years. Tom Wilson had been a good man, a deacon at their Baptist church in Scottsdale, Arizona, and a loving father to their daughter Christine. When he died of a heart attack, Margaret thought her life was over. She had never been alone before. The house felt too big. The silence felt too heavy. Every Sunday morning she sat in the same pew at Scottsdale Bible Church, but now there was an empty space beside her where Tom used to sit. Her daughter Christine noticed the change in her mother. Margaret had always been vibrant, always busy with church activities and book club meetings. Now she barely left the house except for groceries and Sunday service. Christine, 32, and married with 2 children of her own, worried constantly. One afternoon in late spring, Christine sat across from her mother at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows of the comfortable suburban home. Margaret was staring at her coffee cup, lost in thought. "Mum, Dad would want you to be happy," Christine said gently. "He wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone." Margaret looked up, tears pooling in her eyes. "I had my happiness, sweetheart. 30 years of it. That's more than some people ever get." "That doesn't mean it has to be over," Christine insisted. She pulled out her phone and showed her mother a website. "Look, there are dating sites now specifically for people our age. Well, your age, you know what I mean." Margaret actually laughed, the first real laugh Christine had heard from her in months. "Online dating, at my age? Christine, that's ridiculous." "Why is it ridiculous? You're beautiful, you're smart, you have so much life left to live. Just try it, Mum. What's the worst that could happen?" What no one could have predicted was just how terrible the answer to that question would turn out to be. Margaret finally agreed, mostly to make her daughter stop worrying. Christine helped her set up a profile on a dating site called Second Chance Love, designed for people over 50. Margaret felt silly typing out descriptions of herself, choosing photos, listing her interests. Church activities, reading, gardening, long walks, simple pleasures. The messages started coming in within days. Most of them were polite, but forgettable. Then she received a message from a man named Robert Mitchell. His profile said he was 62, a retired businessman from San Diego, California, recently widowed himself. His photo showed a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and kind eyes. He wrote about loss and faith and the courage it takes to try again. Margaret felt something stir in her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the memory of what hope used to feel like. They exchanged messages for 2 weeks before Robert suggested they meet in person. He was planning to visit Scottsdale on business, he said. Would she like to have dinner? Margaret surprised herself by saying yes. That first dinner was at a small Italian restaurant in Old Town Scottsdale. Robert arrived exactly on time, holding a bouquet of yellow roses. Margaret's favourite, though she hadn't mentioned it in her profile. "Just a lucky guess," he said with a warm smile. They talked for 3 hours. Robert was charming and attentive. He asked about her late husband with genuine compassion. He talked about his own wife, Maria, who had died of cancer 2 years earlier. He had 2 grown sons, he said, both living in California. He showed her pictures on his phone. 2 handsome young men with their father's smile. "I never thought I'd want to date again," Robert said as they shared tiramisu. "But you can't grieve forever. At some point, You have to choose to live. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. That's exactly what my daughter keeps telling me. Robert reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Your daughter sounds very wise. By the time he walked her to her car, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. Robert kissed her cheek goodnight and asked if he could see her again. She said yes, before she could overthink it. The courtship moved quickly. Robert started visiting Scottsdale every week. He took Margaret dancing. They went on day trips to Sedona, hiking the red rock trails and watching sunsets that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. He attended church with her, sitting in Tom's old spot, singing hymns in a pleasant baritone. The congregation welcomed him warmly. Pastor David even commented to Margaret after service 1, Sunday, that it was wonderful to see her smiling again. Margaret's book club friends adored Robert. He was polite, well-spoken, and clearly devoted to Margaret. When he surprised her with tickets to see her favorite musical in Phoenix, the ladies declared him a keeper. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Christine was the only one who seemed uncertain. She couldn't quite put her finger on what bothered her about Robert. He was perfect, and that was the problem. Too perfect, too attentive, too good to be true. "Have you met his sons yet?" Christine asked her mother one afternoon while they were shopping for groceries. "Not yet," Margaret said, placing items in the cart. "They're both very busy with their careers. Robert talks to them all the time, though." "What about his friends? Other family members?" Margaret paused, realizing she hadn't actually met anyone from Robert's life. "Well, he's from San Diego. It's not like they can just pop over for coffee." "Mum, you've been dating him for 3 months. Don't you think it's a little strange that you haven't met a single person who knows him?" "Christine, stop being so suspicious. Not everyone has ulterior motives." But Christine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She noticed other small things too. Robert never gave straight answers about his business career. The details were always vague, and he seemed unusually interested in Margaret's finances. How much was the house worth? Did she have life insurance? What were her retirement accounts like? When Christine mentioned these concerns to her husband David, he suggested they do a simple background check, just to be safe. "I don't want to invade Mom's privacy," Christine said. "You're not invading her privacy," David replied. "You're protecting her. There's a difference." What investigators would later realize was that this simple decision to run a background check probably saved Margaret's life. The results came back on a Tuesday afternoon. Christine was sitting at her kitchen table when she opened the email from the background check service. She started reading and felt her blood run cold. Robert Mitchell wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was Robert Michael Kowalski, and he had a criminal history that spanned 3 states. Christine's hands shook as she scrolled through the report. Fraud, identity theft, theft by deception. He had been arrested in California, Nevada, and Florida over the past decade. But it got worse. Much worse. Robert Kowalski was a romance scammer who specifically targeted widowed women between the ages of 50 and 70. He would court them, gain their trust, convince them to give him access to their finances, and then disappear with their money. The report listed at least 7 known victims. Christine felt sick. But then she reached the most disturbing part of the report. In Las Vegas, Nevada, 3 years earlier, a woman named Patricia Hernandez had filed a police report against Robert Kowalski for fraud. She claimed he had stolen nearly $200,000 from her retirement accounts. Before the case could go to trial, Patricia was found dead at the bottom of a hiking trail on the outskirts of the city. The death was ruled accidental. She had apparently fallen while hiking alone. But Robert had been with her that day. He was questioned by police, but never charged. There wasn't enough evidence to prove it was anything other than a tragic accident. Neighbors would never forget what happened next. Christine called her mother immediately. "Mum, you need to come over right now. It's about Robert. It's important." Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, already defensive. "Christine, if you've called me over here just to criticize Robert again..." "Sit down, Mom." Something in Christine's voice made Margaret obey. Christine placed the background check report on the table between them. "His name isn't Robert Mitchell, it's Robert Kowalski. And he's a con, artist who targets widows." Margaret stared at the papers, her face draining of colour. "That can't be right. There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Mom. Look at these arrest records. Look at the photos. It's him." Christine showed her mother everything. The list of victims, the fraud charges, the suspicious death in Nevada. Margaret's hands trembled as she looked through the evidence. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. "Oh my God, I told him about my life insurance policy last week. He asked if I'd ever updated the beneficiary after Dad died. I said I hadn't thought about it." Christine felt her stomach drop. "What did he say?" "He said I should change it, that Christine and the grandkids were already taken care of in my will, so I should list someone who might need it more. Someone like him. He said it was just in case anything ever happened to me unexpectedly. He made it sound so reasonable." "Mom, the woman in Vegas, Patricia Hernandez. She died 3 weeks after, making Robert the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. It was $500,000. The room fell silent. The weight of what Christine was saying settled over them like a heavy blanket. Margaret stood up abruptly, pacing the kitchen. "I need to confront him. I need to hear him explain this." "No," Christine said firmly. "Absolutely not. We're going to the police right now." "I can't just go to the police without giving him a chance to..." "Mom!" Christine's voice cracked. "The last woman who confronted him ended up dead at the bottom of a mountain. Do you understand? He might be planning to kill you." Margaret sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. For 30 years, Tom had protected her, loved her, kept her safe. Now she was alone and had nearly walked straight into the arms of a predator. But what no one noticed yet was that Robert was already sensing something was wrong. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Scottsdale Police Department listened carefully as Christine and Margaret explained everything. She was a veteran detective with 15 years of experience, and she had seen cases like this before. Romance scams were becoming increasingly common, targeting vulnerable seniors with increasing sophistication. "Mrs. Wilson, I want you to understand something," Detective Martinez said gently. "This man is dangerous. I've been in contact with detectives in Las Vegas about the Patricia Hernandez case. They never had enough evidence to charge him, but they believe he killed her. They just couldn't prove it." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. "What do I do?" "Here's what I'm proposing," the detective said. "We wire you up, and you invite him over for dinner. Act normal. Tell him you've decided to make him the beneficiary on your life insurance policy. We need him on tape admitting to his real identity or making threats. Something we can actually arrest him for. You want my mother to wear a wire and bait a potential killer." Christine stood up, furious. "That's insane." "I'll do it," Margaret said quietly. "Mum, no. Christine, listen to me." Margaret's voice was steady now, filled with a strength Christine recognized from her childhood. "If I don't help stop him, he'll just move on to the next woman, the next widow trying to rebuild her life. I can't let that happen. I won't." Detective Martinez looked at Margaret with newfound respect. "You're very brave, Mrs. Wilson. We'll have officers positioned all around your house. If anything goes wrong, we'll be inside in seconds. You'll never be in real danger." But investigators would later realize they had underestimated just how dangerous Robert Kowalski really was. The plan was set for Friday evening. Margaret called Robert and invited him over for a special dinner. She forced cheerfulness into her voice that she didn't feel. "I have some good news to share with you," she told him, "about the insurance policy we discussed." Robert's voice warmed. "That's wonderful. Darling, I'll be there at 7. The hours leading up to Friday evening were the longest of Margaret's life. She went to church on Wednesday night and sat in her usual pew, praying for strength. Pastor David noticed she seemed troubled and asked if she wanted to talk. She thanked him, but said she just needed time to pray. On Friday morning, Detective Martinez came to the house to fit Margaret with the wire. It was a small device that clipped to her bra, nearly invisible. They tested it multiple times to make sure the audio was clear. "Remember," the detective said, "try to get him to talk about his past. Ask about his wife, his sons. See if the details match what he's told you before. And Margaret, if at any moment you feel unsafe, just say the word Thomas. That's your safe word. The second you say it, we're coming in." Christine wanted to be there, but the detective said it would look suspicious. Instead, Christine waited at the police station with her husband David, watching the clock and praying harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. Margaret spent the afternoon cooking Robert's favourite meal: pot roast with vegetables, homemade rolls, apple pie for dessert. Her hands shook as she worked, but she kept moving. She thought about Tom, about their 30 years together, about the life they'd built on trust and faith and honesty. Robert had tried to exploit her grief, her loneliness, her willingness to believe in second chances. She thought about Patricia Hernandez, hiking that trail in Nevada, probably thinking she was about to have a romantic afternoon with a man she trusted. Margaret wondered if Patricia had felt the hands on her back, pushing her over the edge, or if it had happened so fast she never knew what hit her. At 6:30, Margaret set the table and checked her reflection in the hall mirror. She looked pale, but composed. She took a deep breath and whispered a prayer. Robert arrived exactly at 7 o'clock, holding a bottle of expensive champagne and wearing a smile that Margaret now recognized as predatory. How had she not seen it before? How had she mistaken calculated charm for genuine affection? "Something smells amazing," Robert said, kissing her cheek. Margaret fought the urge to flinch. They sat down to dinner and made small talk. Margaret felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, playing a role in a terrible play. Robert was relaxed, confident. He poured champagne and raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said. Margaret forced a smile and clinked her glass against his. "To new beginnings." As they ate, Margaret steered the conversation toward his past, just as Detective Martinez had instructed. "Robert, I realized I've never seen photos of your wife Maria. Do you have any on your phone?" Something flickered across Robert's face. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. But he recovered quickly. "I don't like keeping photos on my phone. Too painful to see them every time I open it." "I understand," Margaret said. "What about your sons? Have you told them about me yet?" "Of course," Robert said smoothly. "They're happy I've found someone. They worry about me being alone." "I'd love to meet them sometime. Maybe we could all have dinner together when they visit." Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They're both very busy. It's hard to coordinate schedules." Margaret pressed on, her heart pounding. "What did you say their names were again? I keep forgetting." "Michael and James," Robert said without hesitation. But that wasn't what he'd told her before. In their first conversations, he'd said their names were David and Christopher. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. And they both live in San Diego? That's right. Near where you and Maria lived? Yes. Robert's voice had an edge to it now. Why all the questions tonight, Margaret? I'm just curious about your life, Margaret said, trying to sound innocent. We've been together for months now, and I realize I don't know very much about you. Robert set down his fork and studied her across the table. The mask of charm was slipping. Margaret could see the coldness in his eyes now. Is something wrong? He asked quietly. No, nothing's wrong. Actually, I have good news. I went to my lawyer this week and changed my life insurance policy, just like we discussed. You're the beneficiary now. $500,000. She watched his face carefully. For just a moment, she saw satisfaction flash across his features. Then the charm snapped back into place. Margaret, you didn't have to do that. I wanted to. You've made me so happy these past few months. I want to know you'll be taken care of if anything happens to me. Robert reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was firm. Too firm. You're very generous. But let's not talk about morbid things like that. You're going to live for many more years. I hope so, Margaret said. But you never know. Look at what happened to Patricia. The name hung in the air between them. Robert's expression went completely blank. Patricia? He said carefully. Patricia Hernandez, in Las Vegas. The woman who fell off that hiking trail 3 years ago. The one you were with when it happened. Robert's hand tightened painfully around Margaret's fingers. She tried to pull away, but he held on. How do you know that name? His voice was cold now, all pretense of affection gone. I know everything, Robert. Or should I call you Robert Kowalski? For a long moment, neither of them moved. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Outside, she knew the police were listening, ready to move. But they needed more. They needed him to confess, to threaten her, to give them something actionable. Robert's face twisted into something ugly. The charming widower was completely gone now, replaced by something dark and cruel. You stupid woman, he said softly. You couldn't just take the bait and keep your mouth shut, just like Patricia couldn't keep her mouth shut. So you did kill her. Robert smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Margaret had ever seen. Patricia was greedy. She threatened to go to the police after she found some financial records I'd forgotten to delete. So we went on a little hike to talk things through. Beautiful view from up there. Long way down, though. One little push, and all my problems were solved. You're insane, Margaret whispered. I'm practical, Robert corrected. He stood up, still gripping her hand, pulling her to her feet. And you just made a very big mistake. But it's going to be okay. We're going to take a little drive, you and me. Up to Camelback Mountain. Beautiful sunset this time of evening. Tragic accident, really. You were still so devastated over losing Tom. The grief just became too much. Margaret's mind raced. She tried to remember the safe word. What was it? Thomas. She needed to say Thomas. But before she could speak, Robert yanked her toward the door. Let's go. Now. No, Margaret said, trying to pull free. I'm not going anywhere with you. Robert twisted her arm behind her back, and Margaret cried out in pain. Yes, you are, unless you want me to hurt you right here. Either way, you're going to die tonight, Margaret. At least if we do this my way, it'll look like an accident. Your daughter won't have to know her mother was murdered. Think about that. Margaret's arm felt like it was about to break. Tears streamed down her face. But she wasn't crying from pain. She was crying from rage. Thomas, she said clearly into the wire. Thomas, I love you. For a second, Robert looked confused. Then the front door burst open and police officers flooded into the house, weapons drawn. Police! Let her go! Hands where we can see them! Robert froze, his grip on Margaret's arm tightening for one agonizing moment. Then he released her, and she stumbled forward into the arms of Detective Martinez. Robert Michael Kowalski, you're under arrest for attempted kidnapping, assault, and murder, the detective said as officers forced Robert to the ground and handcuffed him. Robert was still smiling that terrible smile as they hauled him to his feet. He looked directly at Margaret. You won't be the last, he said calmly. There's always another lonely widow. Always another woman desperate enough to believe in fairy tales. They dragged him out of the house, and Margaret collapsed onto her couch, sobbing. Christine burst through the door seconds later and wrapped her arms around her mother. It's over, Mom. It's over. You're safe. But Margaret knew it would never really be over. The man she'd let into her heart, into her home, into her bed, had planned to murder her. Just like he'd murdered Patricia Hernandez. Just like he would have murdered others if they hadn't stopped him. The trial took place 6 months later in a Phoenix courthouse. Robert was charged with the murder of Patricia Hernandez based on his confession to Margaret, which had been recorded clearly on the wire. He was also charged with fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder in Margaret's case. 7 other women came forward during the investigation. Women in Tampa, Miami, Houston, San Diego, and Las Vegas who had all been conned by Robert Kowalski. One woman had lost her entire retirement savings. Another had signed over the deed to her house. A third had given him access to her deceased husband's business accounts. The prosecution painted a picture of a systematic predator who had spent years targeting grieving widows, exploiting their vulnerability and faith in human goodness. The defense tried to argue that Robert had genuine feelings for these women and just made some bad financial decisions. Nobody believed it. Margaret took the stand and gave her victim impact statement with quiet dignity. She talked about trust and grief and the courage it takes to love again after loss. She talked about Tom, her husband of 30 years, and how Robert had tried to desecrate his memory by filling the space he left behind with lies. This man didn't just steal money from vulnerable women, Margaret said, looking directly at Robert. He stole our faith in love itself. He made us afraid to trust, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that good people still exist in this world. That's a theft that can never be repaid. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Robert Kowalski was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led him away, he turned and looked at Margaret one last time. She met his gaze without flinching. 1 year after the trial, Margaret stood at a podium in the community center of Scottsdale Bible Church, looking out at a room full of women. They were all over 50, all widowed or divorced, all trying to navigate the complicated world of dating after loss. Margaret had started a support group called Second Chances, Safe Choices. She taught classes on how to spot romance scams, how to do background checks, how to protect your finances while remaining open to love. Detective Martinez often came as a guest speaker, sharing statistics and warning signs. The group met every Tuesday evening. Some weeks there were 5 women. Some weeks there were 20. They shared stories, offered support, and reminded each other that being cautious wasn't the same as being cynical. Christine often brought her children to visit Margaret on Sunday afternoons. They would sit in the backyard of the house Margaret refused to sell, eating cookies and watching the grandchildren play. Christine noticed that her mother seemed stronger now, more confident. The experience with Robert had broken something in her, yes, but it had also revealed a core of steel she hadn't known she possessed. Do you ever think about dating again? Christine asked one afternoon. Margaret considered the question. Maybe someday, but not yet. Right now, I'm focused on helping other women avoid what I went through. That feels more important than romance. Dad would be proud of you, Mum. I think he would be, Margaret agreed. Not of the situation, obviously, but of what I've done with it. That evening, after Christine and the kids had gone home, Margaret sat in her living room with a cup of tea and looked at the framed photo of Tom on the mantel. 30 years of love, of trust, of building a life together. Robert Kowalski had tried to erase that. He had tried to make Margaret doubt everything she'd ever believed about love and goodness. But he had failed. Because Margaret knew now that evil doesn't win by being stronger than good. It wins by making good people afraid to trust, afraid to love, afraid to believe in second chances. And she refused to give Robert that victory. She thought about Patricia Hernandez often, a woman she'd never met, but who had saved her life in a way. If Patricia hadn't died, if that case hadn't been in the background, check report, Margaret might have signed those papers, might have gone on that drive, might have been the one found at the bottom of a hiking trail. The police had eventually located Patricia's family in Nevada. Margaret had written them a letter telling them that their mother's death had led to Robert's capture, that Patricia's story had saved other women. It didn't bring Patricia back, but maybe it meant her death hadn't been completely meaningless. As Margaret finished her tea and prepared for bed, she thought about the question Christine had asked. Would she date again? Open her heart to someone new? She honestly didn't know. But she knew one thing for certain. If she ever did try again, she would do it with her eyes wide open. She would trust, but verify. She would hope, but protect herself. She would believe in love, but never again ignore the warning signs. Because that's what surviving teaches you. Not to stop living, but to live more carefully. Not to stop trusting, but to trust more wisely. Margaret turned off the lights and headed upstairs. Tomorrow she had a meeting of her support group. 3 new women were joining, all of them recently widowed, all of them terrified of being alone, but equally terrified of being hurt. She would tell them her story. She would tell them Patricia's story. And she would remind them that being careful doesn't mean being closed off. That you can protect yourself without hardening your heart. Because in the end, that's what Robert Kowalski had really tried to steal. Not just money or life insurance policies. He had tried to steal hope itself. And Margaret had refused to let him have it. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more true stories about survival, faith, and justice. Drop a comment below if you or someone you know has dealt with romance scams. Your story might help someone else stay safe. Together, we can protect the vulnerable and honor those who didn't survive by making sure their stories are never forgotten.